In this slideshow, we're going to take a look at the causes and consequences of World War I, but we're going to pay particular attention to how the First World War is going to shape the United States. And we're going to see that in some ways, the United States is going to end up looking a lot more like Roosevelt's new nationalism in an effort to try and mobilize the nation for the war effort. So where did the causes of the war come from? In part, the causes for World War I came from the national reunification projects conducted in both Italy and in Germany. In Germany in 1870, this nation called Prussia won a war against France, which allowed Prussia to annex the territories of Alsace and Lorraine, which were a sort of disputed region between France and Germany that are part of France today. But also annex the southern part of what would become Germany into Germany. And after 1870, Prussia ceases to exist, and instead we get this new German Empire. This had been a part of a long, decades-long process of trying to unify German-speaking people into a new German nation, taking out what had been a number of smaller states and principalities and creating a large German empire. Something similar happened in Italy. A state in the northern part of Italy called Piedmont had engaged in some smart diplomacy with France, periodic wars in northern Italy, to the point where Piedmont had dominated the northern half of the peninsula, and then came to an agreement with a revolutionary force that had conquered much of the southern part of the peninsula to create the modern-day state of Italy. And what this meant is that the balance of power that had basically kept the peace in Europe since the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 was coming apart. These two new states on the European theater, Germany and Italy, threw all of the balancing acts that had been kept in order into chaos. Ever since the end of the Napoleonic Wars, France had been shrunk, and Russia had been seen as the great arbiter of peace on land. The Russian army had seemed to be the guarantor of military might on the European continent. The United Kingdom had been seen as the guarantor of peace on the high seas, and they combined tried to keep a certain amount of stability and tried to maintain the status quo. The unification campaigns, however, threw all of this out of balance, and what you get after the unification of Germany is a sort of arms race that's taking place on the European continent, particularly as it came to naval forces. Germany was trying to play catch-up with Great Britain, which had the largest navy in the world, dominated the high seas. Germany wanted to catch up with that. They certainly had the industrial heartland to be able to produce a lot of military equipment. For its part, the United Kingdom was quite anxious about all this and ramped up its own naval development. And this was a symptom of a broader competition taking place between these European states on the European continent. And imperialism around the world certainly did little to create humility on the European continent. The postage stamp in front of you here is part of the sort of hubris of Great Britain by the end of the 19th century. The British people loved to brag that the sun never set on the British Empire, meaning there were British territories around the globe, and wherever you went, the sun would be shining because it would never set. The Earth rotates, and when day becomes night, there's always somewhere around the globe that is a British possession that is being illuminated. For many of these European states, these empires that they claimed around the world demonstrated that what they believed to be their technological superiority, but also cultural superiority. So what you have going on in Europe in the years leading up to 1914 is an arms race brewing between these new emerging powers on the European continent and the older dominant powers on the European continent, as well as a nationalist sense within each of these European states that their empires demonstrated how great their nation was, that they could wage this empire, conquer so much of the globe, proved the superiority of their military, of their culture. And by the beginning of World War I, much of the world had been divided into one European empire or another. On the left in front of you is a map of Africa on the eve of World War I. You can see there are only two independent African states on the continent on the eve of the First World War. You have Ethiopia in Eastern Africa, and then on the west coast you have the nation of Liberia. And Liberia was it was independent. It had its own political system, but it was heavily influenced by the United States. Liberia gained its existence as part of a project launched by an organization called the American Colonization Society. So it's independent, but it's also sort of protected by the United States. So much of the continent is controlled by one European state or another. And again, the sort of race for Africa that occurred in the last few decades of the 19th century in the minds of Europeans just proved to themselves that they had this superior way of life, they had this superior culture, and they had superior technology, which justified bringing their superior practices, so they believed, to the rest of the world. If you look at the map of Asia, it looks like much less of Asia was dominated by one European power or another. But China, which appears to be independent here, was sort of quasi-independent. Various European states had what they regarded to be spheres of influence in China, and they waged various wars with the Chinese emperor to try and retain that control, to expand their economic spheres of influence. And so even though China was technically independent, it's heavily influenced and dominated by various European empires. You can see that the Indian subcontinent is dominated by Great Britain. The Netherlands controlled what is now Indonesia. The French had their own imperial claims in Asia. So again, all of these imperial claims around the world, the successes of European arms in China in the last decades of the 19th century, all of this tended to prove in the minds of these various European nations not only the superiority of Europe in their own imagination, but also the superiority of their particular nation. And so this was sort of a recipe for disaster. The building tensions, the arms race, the hubris that is created as Europeans expanded their empires around the world, all of this is going to explode into conflict in 1914 when a spark is ignited in the Balkan Peninsula. What happens in the Balkan Peninsula, you can see it here. It's the peninsula that contains the modern-day states of Serbia, Greece, Macedonia, Albania. What's going on there is this older empire called the Ottoman Empire was losing influence. At the peak of its influence in the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire had extended its empire all the way up to the gates of Vienna itself, in what's now modern-day Austria. But for much of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire had been referred to as the sick man of Europe, as one of the Russian czars referred to it. Its influence was declining, its empire in the Balkan Peninsula was crumbling, and in particular, the Empire of Austria-Hungary and the Russian Empire were competing for influence in the region. And Austria-Hungary had annexed part of the Ottoman Empire's territory to itself, the modern-day state of Bosnia-Herzegovina. And about the same time, Serbia became independent. Many ethnic Serbs lived within Bosnia-Herzegovina and wanted to declare independence from Austria-Hungary and be annexed to Serbia. One of those rebels assassinated the next in line, the person who was going to become the new emperor of Austria-Hungary in the future. Austria-Hungary was understandably quite annoyed and mad about this. They issued a series of demands to Serbia. Serbia agreed to all of them but one, and the failure to accede to that one demand led to Austria-Hungary declaring war on Serbia. Russia had an alliance with Serbia. Russia regarded itself as the protector of all Slavs in Eastern Europe and was not about to stand by while Austria-Hungary picked on the tiny nation of Serbia. So Russia declared war on Austria-Hungary. And when that happens, the alliance system that had been developing in Europe began to unfold until most of the European continent was at war with each other. Germany came to the aid of Austria-Hungary. They had a mutual protection pact. So Germany declared war on Serbia. The Russians began to mobilize against both Austria-Hungary and Germany. Germany was quite anxious about this mobilization and preemptively declared war on Russia. France also declared war on Germany as part of an alliance with Russia, and by the the summer of 1914, rather, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia were all at war with each other. What brings the United Kingdom, or Great Britain, into the conflict is the German invasion of Belgium. The sort of Schlieffen Plan that the Germans had in mind would involve them invading Belgium, and then through Belgium attacking Paris, knocking France out of the war so that Germany could then focus its energies on what they regarded as the bigger threat over in Russia, which had the larger army, though they believed it would be slower in mobilizing. But once Germany invaded Belgium, the United Kingdom declared war on Germany, and then now much of the European continent was at war. Italy sat it out. Technically, they were an ally of Austria-Hungary and Germany. In reality, Italy and Austria-Hungary had significant political differences. They disagreed on where the appropriate border should be between Italy and Austria-Hungary. And so Italy was quite content to sit it out and did not enter the war until 1916 when it joined France, the United Kingdom, and the Russian Empire. What would be quite shocking to Europeans and to Americans is the immense death toll created by the war. By the end of the conflict, we're talking about millions and millions of people who were killed. Single battles will result in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. In an effort to try and break the German line, the British launched an assault in 1916 known as the Battle of the Somme. The result of the Battle of the Somme is that the German line was pushed back a few football yards, a couple hundred yards, at the cost of hundreds of thousands of British lives. These kind of death tolls were shocking. Europeans were not prepared for this. This is not what war had looked like for much of the 19th century. The reason the death tolls were so enormous were because of new technologies. Things like poison gas, but especially machine guns. Machine guns had been used in colonial wars to expand European empires, and what Europeans discovered is that machine guns tended to favor defenders. People who were trying to keep their ground and had a machine gun could mow down hundreds or thousands of people at a time and be able to maintain their position. So machine guns meant that the war quickly devolved into what we call now trench warfare. These trenches became incredibly elaborate. They were, in some cases, like underground cities. They could also be quite miserable because when it rained, the trenches would fill up with water. Troops were often standing in knee-deep or waist-deep water. They were muddy. Dead bodies would just sort of seep into the mud. It looked like hell on earth in some of these places. And for the most part, most Americans said to themselves, thank goodness for the Atlantic. Thank goodness the United States is not in this conflict. As I said in the previous section, Woodrow Wilson ran on a campaign platform of trying to keep the United States out of this conflict. It appears as though that had an effect with the American people, and the voters decided that, yes, they did not want to enter this conflict. They were going to vote for Wilson rather than somebody who suggested the United States ought to be doing more to enter into this conflict. But there will be certain things that will happen that will tend to push the United States ever closer to war. One of the things that kept them out of the war, initially at least, was the ethnic and cultural diversity of the United States. There were a lot of ethnic Germans who lived in the United States, and there were a lot of ethnic Irish. Ireland was part of the United Kingdom, but many Irish people had been longing for independence, and there's going to actually be a rebellion during the First World War as the Irish try to declare their independence from Great Britain. And thus, the Irish in the United States didn't see themselves as in line with the United Kingdom, but rather opponents of the United Kingdom, and wanted the United States to avoid joining with the side of their enemy. So there are a number of factors that come together to try and keep the United States out of this conflict, but there are going to be certain events that happen between 1914 and 1917 that tend to draw the United States into the First World War. One of them is the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915. The German Navy was trying to play catch up, as I said earlier, with Britain. Britain had the largest surface fleet in the world, and it was just going to be impossible for Germany to compete with that. One way they could get around that was by producing submarines. Naval vessels that could dive underwater, avoid attack from large surface vessels, dreadnoughts, big battleships, and they could engage in sneak attacks. Very quickly in the war, the British created a very effective blockade of the German coast, preventing any sort of communication, supplies from entering into Germany. Germany wanted to do that for Britain as well, but that's a rather difficult task. Britain is an island nation. It has a very large coastline, and the reality was the German Navy was simply not going to be able to create a blockade. So instead, the German Navy engages in unrestricted submarine warfare around the British Isles. Any ships going to or coming from Britain were subject to being sunk. The German Empire published articles in American newspapers warning them of this policy, telling Americans, do not travel to the United Kingdom right now. There's this war thing going on, and we're in the process of sinking any ships that go to the United Kingdom. Some Americans traveled anyway, and in 1915, a passenger vessel called the Lusitania was struck by a German submarine torpedo, sank to the bottom, and 128 Americans died. A lot of Americans at that point were calling for war. The Wilson administration avoided it by getting the German high command to no longer conduct a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. Instead, the German submarines would rise to the surface, give fair warning, allow the passengers and crew to disembark, and then sink the ship to the bottom. It's something the German Navy absolutely hates because it makes them vulnerable. Once a U-boat is visible on the surface, an undersea boat, a submarine, is visible on the surface, a cleverly disguised military vessel could sink it to the bottom. The British had a tendency to try and disguise military vessels as passenger liners or cargo ships in an effort to force the German submarines to the surface, where they would be more effectively able to sink them to the bottom. And the German submarines would do this because they would think they were actually passenger vessels or merchant vessels. There are a number of other factors, too, that over time are going to draw more Americans into the orbit of the British and the French. One of them is the reality of propaganda. Since the blockade of the German coast was so effective, all the news about the war is coming from the French and the British perspective. There's also the problem of trade goods. The Lusitania, we now know actually, sank so quickly with one torpedo because it was shipping illegal arms to Great Britain. The torpedo struck the storage room in which a lot of these munitions were held. Those munitions were ignited, they exploded, and sank the boat to the bottom. It's not something that was known in 1915, but it's something that's known later. And over time, as more and more American merchants, businessmen, factories become ever closer tied to the British and French war effort, the fear of a British or French defeat in this war becomes greater. It's seen as a huge financial loss, potentially, if the British and French should lose. And these economic connections are going to also tend to draw the United States closer and closer to the British and the French as the war drags on. And then in 1917, there are going to be a few events that are going to push the Wilson administration over the edge to the point where they go to Congress in April and ask for a declaration of war. One is the fact that Germany's high command thought that the war was nearly over, that the Germans would be winning soon, and they thought the way to win this war would be to knock the British out of the conflict by returning to submarine warfare. They knew it might draw America into the conflict, but they thought it'd be worth it. They knew that the American military was very small, that its industry was primarily geared towards peacetime production rather than military production, and therefore they thought by the time the Americans get mobilized, the war's going to be over. It's all going to be done anyway. So they returned to unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917, and because they knew or thought that the Americans might enter the conflict because of that, the German diplomatic corps wrote off a telegram to Mexico seeking a military alliance with Mexico. The German telegram, as it became known, recognized that Mexico had lost a lot of territory to the United States in the Mexican-American War back in the 1840s, and Germany offered to be on Mexico's side if the United States should enter the war, and not conclude a peace with the United States until Mexico regained what were then the states of Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. Because Britain and France had cut off communication lines, they intercepted this telegram and happily turned it over to the Americans, and most Americans were outraged. The Zimmermann telegram only pushes more and more Americans to seek a declaration of war against Germany, and that's exactly what Woodrow Wilson seeks in April of 1917. Now, on the slide in front of you are some excerpts from Woodrow Wilson's Declaration of War message. Today we don't often declare wars anymore, but technically the Constitution says that the Congress is supposed to declare a war. And so the habit had been that presidents would go to Congress asking for a declaration of war message, and in those requests they would outline the various outrages that they thought existed, warranting some sort of a declaration of war. So in April of 1917, Wilson goes to Congress and outlines what he hopes to accomplish in this war. And he generally outlines some pretty idealistic goals that he has in mind. On the one hand, he wants this to be a war to end all wars, and Wilson's general sense is that empires ruled by emperors and czars, that these things tend to be more warlike. He felt that republics and constitutional monarchies tended to be more peaceful. And by April of 1917, that's kind of how the war was turning out. Russia had a revolution, the Tsar was gone, they had a transitional government. So by April of 1917, it really was a war of the United Kingdom, which was a constitutional monarchy, Republican France, and Russia, which appeared to be headed towards some sort of a constitutional monarchy or republic along the lines of either Britain or France. And in Germany and in Austria-Hungary, what do you have but emperors or Kaisers? So you have these absolutist monarchs who did not actually rule as absolutely as Wilson often framed them, but anyway, he tends to view it as monarchs and emperors versus republics and constitutional monarchies, and the United States had better be on the side of those republicans, those representative-style governments. And he also believed that this was also going to be a war to allow for national self-determination, at least on the European continent. He's not so interested in national self-determination around the globe, but he believes that if people in Europe speak the same language, if they identify as members of the same nation, they ought to have their own state. So what should disappear, he believes, are nations like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was a polyglot collection of dozens of different language groups put into one state. Wilson believed that each of those groups ought to be able to have their own nation state. Now, mobilizing the war, the Wilson administration is going to do an impressive job of taking what had been a peacetime society that certainly had an incredibly large industrial production capacity and turning it from what had been mostly for peaceful production and getting the United States into the war very quickly and ramping up the United States military production as well. Part of the process of mobilizing the U.S. for war is mobilizing public opinion, of convincing Americans that this is in fact the right thing to do. Part of that meant good arguments in favor of the war. One organization that's created to try and sway public opinion to convince Americans that this war is a good idea is the Committee on Public Information. Its leader, George Creel, was in the process of training what he called 4 Minutemen. And the idea of the 4 Minutemen is that in 4 minutes, speaking before an audience, they could convince that audience that the war was just and it's a good thing that the U.S. is involved in this war effort. This particular organization is not a censorship organization. It's not involved in trying to suppress dissent so much as it's trying to sway public opinion in its favor using strong arguments. There are other parts, however, of the United States government that are involved in censorship. A combination of laws that become known as the Espionage and Sedition Acts are sort of vaguely written and allow the government to suppress all kinds of speech opposed to the war effort. The vagueness of these laws meant that speeches made against the United States, against the war effort, could be interpreted as sedition. This proved particularly problematic for the perennial socialist candidate for president, Eugene Debs, who actually got quite a bit of the vote. If you looked closely at the election map in 1912, you'll notice he got about 5% of the vote, which is a pretty sizable number of votes to get for a minor fourth party, I guess, in the election of 1912. So he's a fairly well-recognized public figure. He's not exactly a fringe person by any stretch of the imagination, but like many other socialists, Eugene Debs thought this was the wrong war to be fighting. He said, yes, I don't like the Kaiser, I don't like Prussian militarism, but he saw World War I as a war for capitalists waged by workers. And he thought this was ignoring the real conflict, which was the way in which industrialists were sapping the energy and unfairly taking the labor from people who were in the working class. And so he encouraged his listeners to tear up their draft cards, not show up to draft boards, and for this he's eventually sentenced to 10 years in prison for having violated the Sedition Act. He holds the distinction of being a major presidential candidate for president in 1920 while serving a sentence in jail. The U.S. also had to mobilize the economy. As I said before, the economy up to 1917 had been largely geared towards peacetime production. And then all of a sudden in 1917, the Wilson administration is going to have to figure out how it can recraft this economy to win the war effort in Europe. Part of that is going to be related to food. The Food Administration, which is created during the war, is run by this individual named Herbert Hoover, who becomes something of a hero by the end of the First World War. Herbert Hoover was an amazing administrator, did a great job of getting food over to Europe. By the end of the war, he's largely credited with staving off starvation throughout much of the European continent. Part of the Food Administration's effort are these victory gardens. A promotional poster for them is depicted here. Really, these victory gardens were more morale boosters than they were practical efforts to try and get more food to Europe. The idea behind a victory garden is if you are a resident and you have a yard, you tear up your yard, you plant it with fruits and vegetables, and any food you're eating out of your own yard means that you're doing less food shopping at the grocery store, and that frees up the grocery store food for soldiers and civilians overseas who really need it. Now, like I said, there's not really good evidence to suggest that these victory gardens actually made a dent in anything as far as actual food being sent over to Europe, but it does make Americans, even if they're not serving in the military, feel as though they're doing their part. Like they're helping the war effort, even though they're not maybe producing war material in a factory or serving in the military, and yet they're doing their part to help the war effort by planting their own victory gardens. Now, the War Industries Board is created to restructure American industry for the war effort. It ends ruinous competition between industries. Instead, they're encouraged to work together. The War Industries Board also takes a directing role in what factories are even going to be producing. You know, peacetime production comes to an end, so the production of peacetime automobiles, for example, is stopped, and automobile factories are reconverted into airplane factories, military vehicle factories, and the War Industries Board takes a fairly strong role in directing what's going to actually be produced in these places. So ironically enough, again, Wilson came into office in 1912 promising to kind of restore small businesses, limit the power of big business. He argued that Roosevelt's new nationalism was going too far, and yet during World War I, in an effort to try and win the war, the creation of the War Industries Board seems an awful lot like the kind of new nationalism that Roosevelt was arguing for in 1912. On the slide in front of you is a portion of a letter sent to a black newspaper in Chicago from somebody writing to try and figure out if he's going to be moving up there. What happens in the First World War is a very large number of African Americans living in the South are going to move up to Midwestern and Northeastern cities, dramatically inflating the size of the urban black population throughout the region. These letters are really interesting in revealing why it is these individuals are going. The letter in front of you suggests that this individual is shocked at the kind of salaries he's heard about and sort of is incredulous about it and wondering if this could possibly be true. Is this just a wild rumor? Is it true that you can actually get paid to go up there in the first place before you even start working? He can get a lot of people to go with him if he wants. And you'll notice at the end of the letter that he's desperate to get out of the South, that they want to go anywhere, north, east, west, whatever, just not the South. That certainly factored into it too. There's certainly lots of pushes and pulls that are drawing African Americans out of the South into northern and Midwestern cities. Good salaries. A lot of individuals who had been workers are drafted in the military and no longer in the workforce, and a lot of factories are desperate for workers. Big government contracts to fill and not enough people to make it, and African American workers are more than happy to fill the void quite often. It means a very good sizable income. For many of these individuals, economic debt peonage in the South meant continued poverty, and these good jobs in the North promised access to the kind of consumer abundance that many people in northern cities were beginning to enjoy in the 19 teens. Factoring into that as well is the kind of violence that many African Americans experienced in the South. The 19 teens are in the very heart of the era of lynching. So lynching is often used as a tool in this period to create fear amongst African Americans in the South, to stifle political participation from African Americans in the South. And you can see on the slide in front of you the kind of scale I'm talking about here. Hundreds of thousands of people are moving out of the South, particularly for the cities of the Midwest and Northeast. The picture you see on the slide in front of you gives you the sense of what this so-called Great Migration of World War I, as well as the Great Migration of the Second World War, are going to look like. Lots of African Americans leaving in the First World War for the Northeast, the Midwest. In the Second World War, a lot of that migration shifts to the West, the Pacific coast. And that has a fairly dramatic effect on the location of where African Americans live within the United States. 90% of African Americans prior to 1910 lived in the states of the former Confederacy. But by 1940, that number had dropped to only 77%. In 1918, Germany launches one final assault. They had created a separate peace with Russia, and so they could pour all of their military energy into trying to knock France out of the war. The last push of Germany does not succeed. American troops are entering into France in greater numbers more quickly than Germany had expected, and the result is that the German lines get pushed back. Germany itself collapses. Support for the Kaiser collapses. Much of Germany is in open rebellion. Germany becomes a republic, and the German Republic seeks an armistice. And the terms of this armistice will prove incredibly controversial in the future. Wilson is seen by his counterparts in France and Britain as having come rather late to the game here. And he's going to be able to influence some things. Wilson gets his League of Nations that he really wanted, even though he's not able to get the United States to join the League of Nations. But the armistice, the peace terms that are drawn out at Versailles agree to the creation of this League of Nations. The League of Nations is something like the United Nations today. It's supposed to be a place in Wilson's imagination where nations can meet together, talk about their differences, have a sort of international court to arbitrate things. So that we can avoid any future wars. Because as Wilson said in 1917, he wanted this to be a war to end all wars. He wanted there to be a permanent peace. For the most part, however, Britain and France are holding all the cards here, and they want the peace terms to be focused on revenge. They want reparation payments, particularly from Germany. They forced Germany at the peace treaty to accept the fault for the war, the blame for the war effort. As a result, they're expected to pay the costs of the war. They also break up Germany and Austria-Hungary. You can see the changed political map of Europe on the slide in front of you here. Austria-Hungary is dissolved, and out of it you get the nations of Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, or Romania, portions of Romania anyway. Bulgaria was independent before. And parts of Poland. Germany is a little more complicated because most of the German Empire included people who identified as German or were German speakers. Certainly parts of Czechoslovakia are carved off of the German Empire. Much of Poland comes out of what had been the German Empire. But breaking up Germany is a little bit harder to do. There becomes a demilitarized zone in the western part of Germany, and the German military is severely restricted in size. What bothers a lot of Americans, and people in Western Europe too, is what was going on in Russia. There had been a revolution in 1917 that toppled the Tsar, created this interim government, but disastrously for this interim government, the leaders refused to sign a separate peace with Germany. They wanted to continue the war effort, and this was increasingly conflicting with the sentiments of most Russian people, who saw the war as a disaster for Russia. There was on the brink of mass starvation in the country. And so in the fall of 1918, in the fall of 1917, there was a revolution. And the Bolsheviks, a faction within the broader communist movement in Russia, launched this rebellion, toppled the government, and installed themselves in power. And the Bolsheviks were arguing that Russia needed to get out of the conflict regardless of the cost, that this was the wrong war to be fighting, this was a misdirected war of nations against nations when the real conflict was between workers and their employers. And so they signed a separate peace. And in this separate peace, Russia gave up all of the lands in olive green you see it on the slide in front of you. Some of those lands became independent. Some of them were absorbed into, like, the nations of Poland. Poland is created out of what had been part of Russia and part of Germany. And for its part, the United States and some of its allies during the First World War send aid to Russia to try and undo this Bolshevik revolution. For years after the revolution, there was a civil war waging in Russia, between the Bolsheviks, who were identified as the Reds, and the non-Bolsheviks, who were identified as the Whites. And I call them the non-Bolsheviks because they're actually quite an oddball collection of individuals. Some of them were representatives of the interim government. Some of them were just outright warlords who wanted to carve out their own sphere of influence and really didn't have very strong political connections with anybody. But this certainly proves to many Russians that the Soviet Union that is emerging out of this Bolshevik revolution simply cannot rely upon the Western nations for its own political security. They had worked for years to try and undo the Russian Revolution, created this disastrous civil war that resulted in even more deaths within Russia, and eventually the leader of the Bolsheviks, Vladimir Lenin, there was an assassination attempt on his life that didn't work. He was likely, his life was probably shortened because of the assassination attempt. And when he does die, a new leader of the Bolshevik party is going to take over the country named Joseph Stalin. And Joseph Stalin is going to, in general, be a very paranoid individual, suspicious of everybody, generally has regular purges within the government and military to try and get rid of people who he believes are scheming against him. And certainly has little faith that the Soviet Union can rely upon France, Britain, or the United States for its political security. Now, at the end of the First World War, there's a real crisis, not just in the United States, but around the globe. The U.S. demobilizes. Many of those soldiers who had been serving overseas come home and expect to get their jobs back. Many of them couldn't find them. There's a lot of labor unrest. There's a deep depression that settles in. There are massive labor strikes around the country. And this leads to what becomes known as the First Red Scare in the United States. The Attorney General, a fellow named Palmer, launches an investigation convinced that all of this labor unrest is just a part of the broader campaign of communists to try and spread the revolution around the globe. That it appeared as though the revolution was on the brink of occurring in the United States. It appeared the same way in Central and Western Europe, that those places were also incredibly unstable at the end of the war. And factoring into this as well are race relations within the United States. Shortly before the war erupted, in the United States at least, before the United States entered the war, a movie is produced called Birth of a Nation. And Birth of a Nation restores the Ku Klux Klan into existence. The movie is about the Reconstruction era of the United States, and it provides an interpretation of Reconstruction which suggests that the Ku Klux Klan was a positive force for the American South in overthrowing what they, in the movie, thought of as incompetent and corrupt black rule in the states of the former Confederacy. Even when the movie came out, it was incredibly controversial. The NAACP called on people to protest the movie. They asked theaters not to show it, but it was widely popular. The President of the United States at the time, Woodrow Wilson, was quoted in the movie. Part of his book that he had written about a history of the American people was used to justify the interpretation of the Ku Klux Klan and its significance. Now, this is going to lead to a new Ku Klux Klan that's going to be very popular in the United States during the 1920s. The new Ku Klux Klan of the 20s is going to be very different from the old Ku Klux Klan of the 1870s. The Ku Klux Klan of the 1870s was quite clearly an anti-Reconstruction movement of former Confederate soldiers trying to topple Reconstruction governments. The new Ku Klux Klan frames itself differently. It's not, it believes, against Reconstruction anymore, because Reconstruction is old news. That's dead and gone. But instead, it tends to frame itself as the protector of the true American nation, as they identify themselves. And they believed this nation was under threat from various enemies. Certainly radicalism coming from Europe, so communism, radical socialism. The Ku Klux Klan regarded these as foreign threats that were invading the country. Sometimes just ideas that were filtering over, but sometimes being brought over by immigrants. Eastern and Southern immigrants, they believed, were bringing these ideas with them and fomenting dissent. Certainly the Ku Klux Klan regarded African Americans as a political threat to the United States, and much like the initial Ku Klux Klan, continued to use violence and fear to try and prevent black political participation. Another difference between the old Klan and the new Klan is the popularity of the new Klan in states of the North. In the 1920s, Indiana was a real heartland for this second Ku Klux Klan. Indiana had been part of the United States during the Civil War. It did not secede from the U.S. It was not ruled by a Reconstruction government. But because this new Ku Klux Klan, born out of the popularity of this movie Birth of a Nation, is identified with protecting true Americanism from various political and ethnic threats that they believed were threatening that true Americanism. It's able to gain a wide following amongst people, not just in the South, but in many northern states as well, because it's no longer a secessionist organization, but an organization that has re-identified itself as a nation, as a movement protecting the nation from various enemies. And all of that is to say as well that there is certainly a lot of violence, ethnic violence, at the end of the war as well. A lot of the unrest around the United States is in the form of labor unrest, massive strikes. A lot of the violence, too, is racial violence. A lot of these African Americans who had migrated to northern and eastern cities and Midwestern cities found that they were not particularly welcome in these places. Many white residents of those cities saw them as scarce, as competition for the same scarce jobs that they wanted. And a lot of this violence became particularly intense as soldiers returned home from Europe and believed that black workers had taken their jobs from them and didn't think it was right for them to do so. These kind of economic differences between black and white workers were particularly pronounced in the riots of Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. What happened there is a young black man was accused of rape in an elevator in a building. The charges were incredibly flimsy, but it just so happened that this young black man was the son of a very wealthy black family in Tulsa, Oklahoma. There were a lot of black merchants and businessmen who were doing quite well in Tulsa, and the wealth of his supporters seems to have just enraged even further the white residents of Tulsa. The result of the rioting that ensued is that there were hundreds who were killed in the riots. The vast majority of them were African Americans, and much of what had become known as sort of the Black Wall Street of Tulsa had been leveled. You can see it on the slide in front of you as well, a similar event that occurred in 1917 in East St. Louis. African American workers had been brought into East St. Louis to break a strike. The white workers in the city believed that black workers were taking their jobs. The tensions were high, and then a car had fired into a black crowd. Police officers in a separate car came by later. Black residents fired at the police officers, killing them. And this was the spark that ignited this race war that broke out in East St. Louis. And in general, when these events of racial violence, these riots that broke out across the United States, not just in East St. Louis and Tulsa, but in a number of other cities, Chicago as well, for example, typically the national government stood idly by and suggested this was beyond their reach, this was a state issue, this was not a national issue, leading many African Americans to believe that there was simply no government agency out there looking out for their own interests. Certainly, the presidential leaders left much to be desired for many African American activists. As I mentioned before, Teddy Roosevelt was the first president to invite a black man to dine at the White House as a guest. Right when he became president, he invited Booker T. Washington to come to the White House and be his guest at dinner, creating quite an uproar. Under Republican administrations, things certainly were not entirely rosy for African Americans, but federal jobs tended to be open to black workers in a way that they weren't in state offices or other areas of the national economy. And one area in which black individuals could find employment was within the military. Within the United States, a number of black individuals served in the military, particularly in the Great Plains region. These soldiers became known as Buffalo Soldiers. And for his part, Teddy Roosevelt in 1906 was forced to deal with this issue in Brownsville, Texas. What happened in 1906 is there had been a riot there. Many people in Brownsville blamed the local contingent of Buffalo Soldiers who were nearby for having incited the violence. The officers of the soldiers, who were white, said that they had nothing to do with it. They were in their barracks at the time. But a national investigation ensues. Roosevelt appoints a military officer who was Southern in origin to investigate the matter, and unsurprisingly concluded that a number of the Buffalo Soldiers there were to blame. Booker T. Washington appealed to Roosevelt to overturn this, to not accept this conclusion. He felt it was a miscarriage of justice. Roosevelt went along with it anyway, and it became something of a national scandal for black activists around the country that Roosevelt had not stood up for these black soldiers. Roosevelt himself also was very much a man of his times, believed a lot of the social a lot of the studies being put out by sociologists and anthropologists, which promoted scientific racism, the kind of cultural superiority of Western civilization, as it was often framed. Roosevelt himself tended to divide the world between what he called civilized nations, which tended to include Western Europe and the United States, but also Japan, and the rest of the world he called chaos. And he believed it was the obligation of the civilized world to lead chaos into order, into civilization. So Roosevelt, in many ways, is a rather problematic individual for African American voters to support. A number of African American leaders supported Woodrow Wilson in his campaign in 1912. One of them being an African American publisher who I'd mentioned before, named Trotter, who had thrown his support behind Wilson in 1912 and employed his press to do so, and became incredibly disappointed in the way the Wilson administration conducted itself. Wilson himself wrote this book, A History of the American People, which tended to suggest, as the slide in front of you indicates, that the Ku Klux Klan was a positive force in restoring good governance to the South. That line was quoted in that infamous movie, Birth of a Nation. He also kind of stood idly by while many members of his cabinet segregated their offices. As I said before, by the beginning of the 20th century, some of the few opportunities available for African American workers was within the federal government as bureaucrats. Wilson allowed his cabinet members to segregate these offices, create separate facilities for black and white workers. Wilson made the rather unconvincing claim that this was actually what African American workers wanted, that this would benefit African American workers. A number of leaders, including Trotter, felt betrayed, spoke quite adamantly against this, ended up getting thrown out of Wilson's office at one point when he tried to confront Wilson about this. So for many African American leaders, voters as well, there's just not a good political home for them in the end of the 19 teens. And this is likely going to shape the kind of turn that the Black freedom movement makes at the beginning of the 1920s. And we'll look at that when we look at the Harlem Renaissance and the career of Marcus Garvey.